It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where everything seems normal until it isn't. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. Officer Reynolds was finishing up his routine patrol when the radio crackled with a call about a disturbance near the playground. He sighed, thinking it was probably just another false alarm or some teenagers goofing around. But duty called, so he turned on his siren briefly and headed toward the scene. When he arrived, the park was almost empty except for a young woman sitting on a bench, her head buried in her hands. She looked up as he approached, her face streaked with tears and fear etched into every line of her expression. Her name was Emily, and she didn't waste any time before launching into her story. "I've been followed," she said, her voice shaking. "For weeks now. At first, I thought I was imagining things, like maybe I was being too paranoid. But today it got worse." She explained how someone had been lurking around her neighborhood, watching her from afar. That very afternoon, while walking through the park, she felt like she was being trailed again. When she turned around, there was no one obvious, but she swore she saw movement behind the trees. Officer Reynolds listened patiently at first, jotting down notes. But as Emily went on, describing vague details without much evidence, doubt began creeping into his mind. No witnesses, no clear description of the person following her. Just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. To him, it sounded more like anxiety than an actual threat. "Look," he finally said, trying not to sound dismissive but failing nonetheless. "I understand you're scared, but we need something concrete to work with here. Without proof, a name, a license plate, anything, I can't do much." His tone softened slightly, but his message was clear. This wasn't enough to act on. Emily stared at him, disbelief washing over her face. How could he not see how serious this was? She knew what she experienced, even if she couldn't explain it perfectly. Frustration bubbled inside her, mixing with the fear she'd been carrying for days. "You don't believe me," she said flatly, standing up. "Fine. But wait until my dad hears about this." With that, she stormed off, leaving Officer Reynolds standing by his car, scratching his head. Something about her parting words lingered in his mind, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. For now, he shrugged it off, figuring she'd calm down once she realized there was nothing to worry about, or so he told himself. Little did he know, those words were more than just an emotional outburst. They were a promise. And promises made by Emily's father weren't the kind people forgot easily. Emily walked home that night, her heart pounding and her mind racing. Every step felt heavier than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, even though the streets were quiet and empty. The encounter with the officer had left her more shaken than she cared to admit. His dismissive attitude stung deeply, but what hurt even more was the thought of being alone in this fight. She didn't want to feel like she was overreacting, but the fear inside her was real, too real to ignore. Once she got home, Emily locked every door and window, double-checking each one as if her life depended on it. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, hesitating for a moment before dialing the one person she knew would always have her back, her dad. The call connected after a couple of rings, and his deep, steady voice came through the speaker. "Hey kiddo, what's going on?" he asked, sensing something was off just by the tone of her voice. Emily took a deep breath, trying to hold herself together, but the words spilled out in a rush. She told him everything, the strange feeling of being followed, the unsettling encounters, and finally, the humiliating visit from the officer who didn't believe her. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face again. There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, and Emily braced herself for what her dad might say. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet firm. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not imagining things, and you're definitely not alone in this. I'll be there tomorrow morning. We'll figure this out together." Hearing those words brought a wave of relief crashing over her. Emily had always admired her dad's strength and determination. He wasn't the kind of man who let problems linger or swept things under the rug. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it was him. Still, part of her worried about what his arrival might mean. Her dad wasn't exactly known for holding back when it came to protecting his family. She could already picture the confrontation with the officer, and it wouldn't be pretty. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside her apartment made her jump. a car driving by too slowly, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. She kept replaying the day's events in her head, wondering if she should have handled things differently. Maybe she hadn't explained herself clearly enough. Or maybe the officer was right, and she was letting her imagination run wild. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't paranoia. It was real. As dawn broke, Emily dragged herself out of bed, exhausted but determined to face whatever came next. She glanced at the clock and realized her dad would be arriving soon. Just thinking about it gave her a mix of comfort and unease. On one hand, she felt safer knowing he'd be there. On the other, she couldn't help but wonder how far he'd go to get answers, and whether that would make things worse. When she heard the familiar rumble of his old truck pulling up outside, her heart skipped a beat. She peeked through the curtain and saw him stepping out, wearing his signature leather jacket and boots. He looked exactly like she remembered, strong, confident, and ready for anything. For a brief moment, all her fears melted away. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he pulled her into a tight hug. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but full of concern. "I am now," she whispered, clinging to him for a few seconds longer than usual. After letting her go, he stepped inside and sat down at the kitchen table. "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Tell me everything again from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So Emily did. She recounted every detail, starting from the first time she noticed she was being followed. She described the uneasy feeling that had grown stronger over the weeks, the shadowy figure she swore she'd seen in the park, and the way the officer brushed her off like it was no big deal. Her dad listened intently, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. Then, looking directly at her, he added, "We're going to the police station. You deserve better than what you got yesterday." Emily nodded, grateful for his support, but still nervous about what might happen next. One thing was certain. With her dad by her side, things were about to get interesting and possibly explosive. The next morning, Emily and her dad got into his old pickup truck and headed straight to the police station. The drive was quiet for the most part, with Emily staring out the window, lost in thought. Her dad gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he wasn't just here to chat, he meant business. When they arrived, the station was bustling with activity. Officers moved back and forth, phones rang non-stop, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork. Emily hesitated at the entrance, suddenly feeling small and out of place. But her dad didn't give her time to second-guess herself. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and said, "Let's go." Inside, they approached the front desk where a young officer sat typing away at a computer. "We need to speak to the officer who handled my daughter's case yesterday," her dad said firmly, his voice carrying enough weight to make the officer look up from his screen. "Name?" the officer asked, glancing between them. "Reynolds," Emily replied softly, but her dad repeated it louder, almost like he wanted everyone in the room to hear. After a moment of shuffling through some files, the officer nodded and picked up the phone. A few minutes later, Reynolds appeared, looking surprised, and maybe even a little nervous, to see them. His eyes darted between Emily and her dad, clearly unsure what to expect. "This is him," Emily said quietly, stepping back slightly as if to let her dad take the lead. And take the lead he did. Her dad stepped forward, towering over Reynolds by at least half a foot. He introduced himself with a firm handshake that lingered just long enough to make its point. Then, without wasting any time, he launched into why they were there. "My daughter came to you for help yesterday," he began, his tone calm but laced with authority. "She told you she's been followed, stalked, for weeks now. Instead of taking her seriously, you brushed her off like it was nothing. Let me tell you something. I don't care how many cases you deal with or how busy you are. When someone comes to you scared and asking for help, your job is to listen, really listen." Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but her dad held up a hand, cutting him off before he could say a word. "I'm not done," he said sharply. "If anything happens to my daughter because you chose to ignore her, I swear to you, I will hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other?" The room went silent. Other officers nearby had stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange. Reynolds looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat and tried to explain himself. I didn't mean to dismiss her concerns, he stammered. But without evidence, there's only so much I can do. It's protocol. Her dad raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Protocol doesn't protect my daughter, he shot back. What if this guy decides to escalate? What then? Aren't you going to stand there and say sorry, but we needed more proof? Reynolds didn't have an answer for that. He glanced at Emily, who stood quietly beside her dad, watching the confrontation unfold. She looked smaller than usual, but there was a newfound determination in her eyes. Having her dad fight for her gave her strength, even though she still felt vulnerable. After a tense pause, Reynolds sighed and nodded. Look, I'll look into it again, he promised. Maybe there's something I missed. Her dad crossed his arms over his chest, clearly not satisfied but willing to give him one last chance. You better, he said pointedly, because if I find out you're slacking on this, I won't hesitate to bring it up the chain. Got it? Got it, Reynolds replied quickly, avoiding eye contact. As they left the station, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That was intense, she admitted, glancing at her dad. He gave her a small smile. Sometimes people need a wake-up call, he said simply. Now let's get you home. We've got work to do. Back at her apartment, her dad started making calls to friends, acquaintances, anyone who might be able to help gather information. He wasn't about to leave things entirely in the hands of the police, not after what happened earlier. As he worked, Emily watched him, marveling at his energy and focus. She'd always known her dad was protective, but seeing him in action like this was something else entirely. Later that evening, as they sat together going over details, Emily felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. With her dad around, she knew they wouldn't stop until they got answers, even if it meant shaking up the entire system to get them. That night, Emily tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't let her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside felt like a warning. She kept replaying the day's events in her head, the confrontation at the police station, her dad's unwavering determination, and the uneasy look on Reynolds' face when he promised to look into things again. Part of her wanted to believe he'd follow through this time, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that they were still on their own. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere near her apartment. At first, she thought it was just the wind or maybe a stray cat knocking something over. But then it came again, louder this time, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. Her heart began to race as she crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the pavement. For a moment, she didn't see anything unusual. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement, a figure standing near the corner of the building, partially hidden by the darkness. Panic gripped her chest. Was this the same person who had been following her? Or was she imagining things? Either way, she knew she couldn't stay quiet. Grabbing her phone with trembling hands, she sent a quick text to her dad, who was staying in the guest room down the hall. Dad, I think someone's outside. Within seconds, he was at her door, fully alert. He didn't ask questions, he just grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the front entrance. Emily followed close behind, clutching a baseball bat she kept near the door for emergencies. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit them, and the sounds of the neighborhood seemed unnaturally loud. The figure she'd seen earlier was gone, but the sense that someone had been there lingered heavily. Her dad scanned the area methodically, shining the flashlight into every shadowy corner. Stay behind me, he instructed, his voice low and steady. They walked around the building, checking alleys and parked cars, but found nothing concrete, no signs of forced entry, no discarded items that might belong to an intruder. Still, her dad wasn't convinced. We're not dealing with amateurs here, he muttered under his breath as they returned inside. Whoever this is, they know how to stay hidden. But trust me, they made a mistake tonight. Emily sank onto the couch, her legs weak with relief and exhaustion. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her dad sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. We keep our eyes open, he said firmly, and we don't back down. If they think scaring you will make you give up, they're wrong. We're going to fight back harder. He spent the next hour securing the apartment even further, double-checking locks, moving furniture against doors, and setting up makeshift alarms using cans and string near the windows. It was clear he wasn't taking any chances. Emily watched him work, grateful for his presence but also terrified of what might come next. What if the stalker decided to escalate? What if the police still didn't take them seriously? Meanwhile, across town, Officer Reynolds couldn't shake the memory of their visit earlier that day. The man's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk if anything happens to my daughter because you chose to ignore her. Asterisk for the first time, he started questioning whether he'd done enough. He pulled up Emily's file on his computer, reviewing the notes he'd taken during their initial conversation. Something about her demeanor stuck with him. She hadn't seemed like someone making things up. Maybe he should have pushed harder, asked more questions, looked deeper. But pride got in the way. Admitting he'd been wrong wasn't easy, especially not after being called out so publicly. Still, the nagging feeling in his gut grew stronger as the hours passed. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, he picked up the phone and called a colleague, a seasoned detective known for handling difficult cases. I need your help with something, Reynolds said hesitantly. There's a situation I might have mishandled. Back at Emily's apartment, her dad stayed awake long after she finally drifted off to sleep. He sat in the living room, flashlight in hand, staring out the window. His instincts told him the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whoever was targeting his daughter was playing a game, testing their limits. And while Emily might have felt powerless, her dad wasn't about to let fear win. He had faced tougher battles before, and he wasn't backing down now. As the clock ticked closer to dawn, he whispered to himself, almost like a promise, "You want to mess with my family? Bring it on." 2 days had passed since the unsettling night outside Emily's apartment, but the tension in the air hadn't eased. Her dad remained on high alert, barely sleeping and constantly checking every corner of her neighborhood. He'd even started parking his truck closer to her building, just in case. Emily tried to act normal, going to work, running errands, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, her eyes darted around nervously, scanning for anything out of place. Then one afternoon, it happened again. Emily was leaving her office when she noticed a man lingering near the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't doing anything obvious, just standing there, leaning against a lamppost, but something about him felt off. His gaze seemed fixed on her, unblinking and intense. She froze, her heart pounding as memories of all the previous encounters flooded back. This time, though, she didn't hesitate. Pulling out her phone with trembling hands, she called 2 numbers simultaneously, her dad and the police. Her dad answered first, his voice sharp with urgency. "Where are you?" he demanded. "In the parking lot," she whispered, keeping her voice low so the man wouldn't hear her. "There's someone here." "I think it's him." "I'm on my way," her dad said firmly before hanging up. Moments later, an officer arrived, a younger one this time, not Reynolds. The officer introduced himself politely and listened carefully as Emily explained what she'd seen. Unlike Reynolds, this officer didn't dismiss her concerns or brush them aside. Instead, he took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions, making sure to capture every little detail she could remember. It was a small comfort, but it meant the world to Emily after everything she'd been through. Meanwhile, her dad showed up within minutes, his truck screeching to a halt near the entrance of the parking lot. He jumped out, his towering frame drawing immediate attention. Without waiting for explanations, he strode toward the lamppost where the man had been standing. But by the time he got there, the figure was gone, vanishing into thin air like smoke. Frustrated but undeterred, her dad joined Emily and the officer. Together, they reviewed security footage from nearby cameras. At first, it seemed like another dead end. The man had positioned himself strategically out of view. But then, after hours of sifting through grainy clips, they caught a break. A blurry image appeared on the screen. A face partially hidden beneath a hoodie, staring directly at Emily as she walked to her car. "That's him," Emily said, her voice shaking with both fear and relief. "That's the guy who's been following me." The discovery gave them something tangible to work with. Using the footage, the police were able to identify the man. It turned out he was a former co-worker of Emily's, someone she vaguely remembered but never interacted with much. What they'd uncovered next sent chills down her spine. This wasn't just random stalking. The man had developed an unhealthy obsession with her over the months, tracking her movements and even showing up at places she frequented. When the news reached Reynolds, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since their last meeting came crashing down. He realized now how wrong he'd been to dismiss Emily's fears without digging deeper. Determined to make things right, he reached out to the detective handling the case, offering whatever assistance he could provide. Though reluctant at first, the detective agreed to keep him involved, knowing his local knowledge might help speed things along. As for Emily and her dad, the confirmation of the stalker's identity brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, they'd finally had proof that Emily wasn't imagining things. On the other, the reality of the situation hit hard. This wasn't just some harmless prank, it was real danger. Her dad refused to let her stay alone, insisting she come home with him until the situation was resolved. Emily didn't argue. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, not because the threat was gone, but because she knew her dad would do anything to protect her. One evening, as they sat together at his house, Emily looked at him and said softly, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Dad." He smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "You'll never have to find out," he replied. "No matter what happens, we're in this together." The investigation continued, with the police working tirelessly to track down the suspect. Meanwhile, Reynolds paid a visit to Emily, this time with genuine remorse written all over his face. "I owe you an apology," he admitted, looking her straight in the eye. "I should have listened to you from the start. I won't let my mistakes get in the way of keeping you safe." Emily nodded slowly, accepting his apology but still cautious. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But she appreciated the effort, especially since it signaled a shift in how seriously the authorities were taking her case. With each passing day, the pieces fell into place. The stalker's behavior grew bolder, leaving behind more clues that led the police closer to catching him. And while Emily knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she also knew one thing for certain. As long as her dad was by her side, she could face anything. The investigation moved quickly after the breakthrough with the security footage. With a clear lead and mounting evidence, the police finally had something solid to act on. They'd identified the stalker as a man who used to work in the same office building as Emily. At first glance, he seemed harmless, quiet, unassuming, the kind of person you'd barely notice in a crowded room. But beneath that ordinary exterior lay an obsession so intense it bordered on dangerous. As the days passed, the authorities pieced together his patterns. He'd been stalking Emily for months, carefully tracking her routines, where she parked her car, which coffee shop she visited during lunch breaks, even the times she left her apartment. The more they uncovered, the angrier Emily's dad became. "This isn't just some guy with a crush," he muttered one evening while reviewing case updates with Emily. "He planned this. He thought he could control you." Emily nodded, and hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. She felt a mix of fear and anger. Fear because she realized how close he'd come to invading every part of her life, and anger because no one should have to live like this. Her dad noticed the tension in her posture and placed a reassuring hand over hers. "We've got him now," he said firmly. "He won't get away with it." Finally, the day came when the police arrested the stalker. It happened early in the morning, just as he was leaving his apartment. Officers surrounded him before he could react, cuffing him and reading him his rights. When Emily heard the news, she broke down in tears, not out of sadness, but out of sheer relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. Her dad drove her to the station later that day so she could formally identify him. Sitting in a small, dimly lit room, she watched through a two-way mirror as the officers brought him in. Even though she couldn't see his face clearly, there was no mistaking the way he carried himself. The same slouched posture, the same restless energy she'd noticed outside her workplace. Just seeing him made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Afterward, Officer Reynolds approached her, his expression filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I messed up and I let you down. But I promise you, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." Emily looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. His apology didn't erase everything that had happened, but it showed he was trying to do better, and that mattered. With the suspect in custody, the legal process began. Emily testified in court, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. Her dad sat beside her throughout the trial, offering silent support whenever she needed it. The courtroom was tense, especially when the defense tried to paint her as overly anxious or mistaken. But Emily stood her ground, recounting every detail of what she'd endured. By the end of her testimony, even the judge seemed moved by her courage. In the end, the verdict came back guilty. The stalker was sentenced to prison, bringing a sense of closure to Emily and her family. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Emily felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally lifted. Her dad wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You did it," he said proudly. "You faced it head-on, and you didn't back down." But the victory wasn't just personal, it also marked a turning point for the police department. Reynolds, humbled by the experience, took steps to ensure similar cases wouldn't fall through the cracks in the future. He pushed for better training programs for officers, emphasizing the importance of listening to victims and taking their concerns seriously. Other officers followed suit, inspired by the dedication shown by Emily and her dad. For Emily, life slowly started returning to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a harrowing experience. She still double-checked locks and glanced over her shoulder occasionally, but those habits faded with time. What stayed with her, though, was the unwavering bond she shared with her dad. Through every moment of fear and uncertainty, he'd been her rock, proving that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up when it matters most. One night, as they sat together under the stars, Emily turned to him and smiled. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly, "for everything." He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Anytime, kiddo, anytime." Months passed since the trial, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for Emily. The fear that had once shadowed her every move started to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence she hadn't felt in years. Walking through her neighborhood or sitting in her favorite coffee shop, she no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps behind her. It wasn't that she forgot what had happened. It was that she faced it head-on, with her dad by her side, and come out stronger on the other side. Her dad, too, seemed different. There was still a protective edge to him, of course. He couldn't turn that off if he tried. But there was also a sense of peace. Knowing that justice had been served gave him closure, and seeing Emily regain her independence filled him with pride. He often joked that she was tougher than he'd ever been, though deep down, he knew part of her strength came from standing up to the situation together. The relationship between Emily and the police department also improved over time. Officer Reynolds kept his promise to do better. He reached out to Emily occasionally, checking in to see how she was doing and updating her on changes being made within the force. His efforts weren't just lip service, he genuinely wanted to make amends. One day, he invited her to speak at a training session for new recruits. At first, Emily hesitated. Public speaking wasn't exactly her thing, but she agreed after some encouragement from her dad. Standing in front of the group of young officers, Emily shared her story honestly and openly. She talked about the fear, the frustration, and the helplessness she felt when no one believed her. But she also spoke about hope the moment things began to change, thanks to persistence and support. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Many of the officers approached her afterward, thanking her for sharing her experience and promising to take her message to heart. For Emily, it was a powerful reminder that her story could help others avoid going through what she did. As weeks turned into months, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The ordeal had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She was more aware of her surroundings now, yes, but she was also more resilient. More willing to trust her instincts and speak up when something didn't feel right. And while she wished none of it had ever happened, she couldn't deny that it had brought her closer to her dad in ways she never imagined. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, her dad broke the comfortable silence. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I always knew you were strong. But seeing you handle all this, well, let's just say I'm even prouder of you than before." Emily smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied softly. "You showed me what real strength looks like, not just fighting battles, but sticking around until they're won." He chuckled, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "That's family for you," he said simply. "We show up, no matter what." And show up he had, from the very first phone call to the final court date. His presence had been the constant thread weaving through the chaos, grounding Emily when everything else felt uncertain. Even now, as life moved forward, she knew she could count on him for advice, for laughter, or just for someone to sit with on quiet evenings like this. Looking back, Emily realized the hardest parts of the journey had taught her the most valuable lessons. She learned to trust herself even when others doubted her. She discovered the power of persistence, refusing to give up until she was heard. And perhaps most importantly, she understood the importance of having someone who believes in you unconditionally, even when you struggle to believe in yourself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for her dad, for the people who had supported her along the way, and even for the challenges that had shaped her into the person she was today. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was hers. And with her dad by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. "Hey, Dad," she said suddenly, breaking the peaceful quiet. "Yeah, kiddo." "Thanks for showing up in full force," she teased, nudging him playfully. He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Always will, kiddo, always will."